This podcast is coming to you from Wongal and Gadigal country, also known as Balmain, where the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we share and agree that sovereignty was never ceded. Well, a big shout out to all of the JustER Generation listeners. It's great to have you back listening to this episode of A JustER Generation. Today we have another long-time friend and colleague of the Edmund Rice Centre, Mr. Peter Murphy. Peter is a journalist, researcher, anti-war and human rights activist and campaigner. He is the Secretary of the Sydney Peace and Justice Coalition and Chairperson of the Global Council of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. He has for some time also been a strong advocate for human rights in Iran and other parts of the world. Peter, welcome to A JustER Generation.
Thank you very much, Alopi.
So, Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to social justice and what brought you to basically what looks like a career of working on social justice issues.
Yes, it is a career, unpaid mostly. But, I think I have to go back to my childhood, which was very devout Catholic upbringing in Brisbane. And, the values of telling the truth, taking care of everybody around you, being part of the community properly, that's really where it's still all coming from. But, of course, I grew up and had to make my own way in the world. And I'm not so religious anymore. But a few experiences I had with Aboriginal people in Central Australia and being a student on a low income for a few years really made me commit myself to work for a better world and especially against racism, and all of that just kept on developing as I went through my years.
So you were in Central Australia, you're saying, for a little while. What took you there?
I was an anthropology student at Macquarie University, and a group of us went to a summer school in Pitjantjatjara language, which was run at a church institute. It was called the Institute for Aboriginal Development in Alice Springs. It was a Uniting Church project. And just that few weeks in December of 1974, it's just like what I hear people say today about Alice Springs. It's a very polarised town. There's an enormous amount of open racial abuse directed at Aboriginal people, and it's a completely unacceptable way of life, in fact. And I was really profoundly shocked. I was only 21 years old then. And that was one of the crucial things. I thought, wow, we've got a very deep problem in Australia. How will we ever change this? But I'll find out how if I can.
I mean, it ties into, obviously, 1974 is nearly 50 years from 2023, when we've just had a vote to give voice to First Nations people in the country, and that was soundly defeated as part of the referendum. And have you thoughts about, given that early experience, of what might be a way for us to think through some of these issues as a nation? Because obviously First Nations peoples put forward a relatively small ask in many respects, and in the end were knocked back by Australia as a country, despite the many strides we've made on reconciliation, on recognition, on acknowledgement of country and elders. What more from your perspective can be done in that space?
Well, I think we have to have some kind of well thought out national effort at truth telling. That's what's needed. I couldn't be more surprised by the report from the ANU researchers on the voting intentions or voting attitudes for the referendum. They found something like 70% of the no voters support the idea of a voice. So I think that there's a lot of self-delusion, willful, going on. So people do quite a harsh thing by voting no, and then when they're surveyed afterwards, they say, "Oh no, actually, I don't really think that at all." Well, I think that there's a huge embarrassment in the country because there's no way around what happened. It's a dominating view that Aboriginal people are lesser and deserve less, and we're going to make sure that they get less. That is really, really what was said with the no vote. And so I think, unfortunately, not enough has been done in this last 50 years of my life, even though many, many people have worked very, very hard to change this reality.
Yeah, I think there's food for thought for all of us going forward around, and not so. I mean, in many respects, it's mainstream Australia has to have a careful look at itself around how it wants to be as a country, and I think that's something we all need to be thinking about going forward. Obviously, moving from our country with the challenges we've had with the democratic process, we can move into places like Iran, in a region that has been an important area of focus for you and your work recently, and for the last 20 years, I understand. What is it about the region and its people that compels and commits you to have what you've done for such a long period of time and engaged in on for such a long period of time? And perhaps you can talk about more recent events that have really shaped your own thinking and approach in that regard.
So it was really the Iraq War in 2003, which brought me back into contact in a strong way with the Iranian people. But back in the 1970s, I was paying a lot of attention because as I saw then what was happening in Iran as part of a worldwide movement, against domination by United States. We'd just come out of the Vietnam War, and there was a sense of hope that a lot of things could change for the better. And there was a revolution in Iran, but it was drowned in blood, within a couple of years of 1979. And I really did lose touch with what was happening. There was no information. So in 2003, I found these Iranian people in Belmore Park in Sydney collecting signatures on a petition. This was on Hiroshima Day, so 6 months or so after the invasion of Iraq. And I asked if we could have more of a talk, and so that's really where it began. So Iran is a place tortured really by repression. Enormous number of people, civilians, have been killed by a regime which is very much extremist, fundamentalist, sort of backward-looking, really, approach to the world. And the more, of course, you terrorize people, the more resistance you will provoke. Well, whether people have to be quiet about it, they certainly in their minds will never accept that kind of treatment as anything right. So, I'm very much in admiration of the people I've met. Nearly all of the Iranians I know in Sydney, there's a lot, have been themselves tortured and held in prison. They got to Australia in the 80s and 90s, especially the 90s, as refugees. And nearly all of them have relatives who were executed in the 1980s. So they bear a very big burden of pain. So Australia has also been very involved in the Middle East. Even when I was a kid, I read all about the Australian military exploits, if you can call it that, in World War II and then World War I. And then we were back again in 2003. So there's actually a lot of action by Australian government paid for by taxpayers, but there's very little real knowledge among the population of Australia about what's happening. So you're working against all of that. But I think just to wrap it up on Iran, Alopi, if the people could win their democracy in Iran, and they're very close to doing it, then I think we would see a pretty well peaceful Middle East. That's how much trouble these fundamentalists in Tehran are causing. So they're really the driver of war in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and I think they've had quite a hand in Palestine. So you can see there's millions of people have been displaced and probably millions killed as a result of that regime.
I mean, I guess one of the questions is in terms of the geopolitical context around, the Middle East and the fact that, it's a high stakes game of energy and of other things that are part of the reasons why, it's such a focus for the world and therefore, a very volatile mix of interests that come into play that actually result in some of this conflict. Have you had thoughts about, even if in the case of Iran having an outcome to see a democratic system in place, a more peaceful, would that necessarily take away some of the challenges and drivers that shape the region as a whole? Because obviously Iran is not alone in some of the conflict and internal strife that has been part of that region.
Yes, but I think it is the most significant driver of them. The other really big influential countries in the region are Egypt and Turkey, but you don't see them doing anything like what Iran has been doing. So and they've got authoritarian governments as well. But I think that the Iranian one is seen by all of them as a danger. So if there was a democratic government created in Iran, there would be a positive engagement in the region rather than this troublemaking thing. But underlying it, there's the geopolitics of oil. And, I think the oil era is coming to a close, but not fast enough for the pressure to come off this region. It might take another 20 years or so, maybe even I might be optimistic there, but I hope within 20 years, we're not got a world driven by oil anymore. But it's such a vital resource, especially for militaries in the very first place, but then for all industries. So while ever that pressure is there, it's easily there's a huge amount of money involved, and it provokes a lot of violence.
No, I think there's so much now that is being thought about, even in terms of research. Books like Peter Frankopan's book on the Middle East, but also the broader Silk Road that looked into the history of some of this and the context of just even in the 20th century, the high stakes game that actually developed as part of what shaped the Middle East for the last 100 years even is quite interesting. As moving on from that, as someone who has been involved in human rights advocacy and campaigning over a long time, it would be good to get your reflections on what has changed, what remains the same, and what perhaps needs to be thought about by younger generations taking on some of the causes that are their passions in terms of playing not just the short, but also the medium and longer game in terms of advocacy and social justice. Obviously, the younger generation wants to get change immediately, but sometimes it does take, sometimes years of effort, often to very little return, to get an outcome. And I thought it'd be good to have a bit of a reflection from you now. You have the benefit of hindsight.
Well, first of all, I think that you've got to be ready for the long haul. There's very, very few things that I've been involved with which have been won in the short haul. I would say, in my lifetime, I was very surprised in my youth that the women's movement, which really had a sort of resurgence in the 60s, made very big breakthroughs within a decade. It's still got a lot of fighting on its hands, though. And I was also involved with the LGBTQ push in the 1970s. And in relatively terms, we got some big breakthroughs within 10 years. But then also I experienced that issue or that struggle in our society is definitely not resolved yet. But the longer term things, like one of the very first campaigns I ever touched on was the anti-apartheid. That was 1971, and it took till 1994 for a sort of striking change to take place in South Africa. And that's really was like a 50-year campaign. And Timor is another one, which began for me in 1975 and took till 1999. So a lot of people gave up by 1978 on that one. But I myself realized that you just keep on working for what is right. Keep trying to find new ways to convince the powers that be that they need to shift. And eventually something gives. You can never predict what it is. And so, anti-war is another thing. We all hoped after 1970s and especially the end of the Vietnam War that everyone had learned a lesson and there'd be no more of these colonial wars. But no, that's just repeating itself all over again. So we've got a lot of deep problems to address, and you've got to be prepared to take whatever amount of time. Don't ever give up. It's sort of burned into my brain, and for at the personal level, I've made a lot of choices which seem not that rational. Like there's no career in my life really, but I think being sort of seduced by the idea that your own personal ambition is the most important thing. That's to me probably a big error of judgment. And of course, there's a lot of voices in our society telling you that's what you should do. But generally, I think where you're faced with the choice of being true to yourself and taking care of those around you, or trashing somebody or some place, always go for the truth and for the people. That really has certainly made my life, I think, very fulfilling, and I've got a sort of happiness in me as a result, I think, of staying that way.
Work of social justice, and it's almost an asceticism in some ways of a way of living and committing your life to things. And I'm always struck by those who have committed their lives. Often, you would call them other things in other times, as ascetics or mystics or other words. But now they're sort of activists in one sense. So, just in terms of going back on that question of approach, obviously, social media has changed the game a lot. And, where before we would have been out there pamphleteering or petitioning or doing other things in a certain way, there's obviously some great opportunities, but also challenges that come with the technology and where things have moved to. Have you got any thoughts in that regard around, lessons learned? Is it still the same process ultimately, or do people need to really get on board with understanding what the technology brings to advocacy and social justice?
Yes. Well, I do think that you have to use whatever means of communication, especially, are available. And so in our time, social media is definitely part of the spectrum. But if you look back in history, the progressive change was driven by people who, used the printing press. Then they made badges. I'm talking about the anti-slavery campaign. They did petitions. Then they had newspapers. Then they had radio stations. It was when television came along that the capital required was a bit of a daunting barrier, and I don't believe we had any, like in Australian history, we never had any, progressive campaign that had its own TV. But now we've got social media, and of course we should grasp it. But it's just like all those other media. It's still dominated by the other side. It's still dominated by the really rich and powerful. And it's been a bitter lesson, I think, for all of us who are enthusiastic about all these new toys and enjoy using them, that, the Donald Trump stuff, the misinformation is mind-bogglingly hard to confront, and it's really overwhelming us. So it's just a battle on another front, and we all have to be actually better at it. My view is I need a bit more training, and I think younger people are much more intuitively grasping it than older people, but there's no real barrier. It's just your own attitude here, and I do think that video is clearly, like imagery rather than printed words, is now far more effective and more available and more used in all of our social debates and arguments. So we've got to be very much with it and use that as best we can.
I mean, I think this comes into my next question. With the ongoing change in the environment in which social justice, human rights, and other advocacy is done, it would be good to get your reflections on what should be done to lay the groundwork for future emerging leaders in social justice to take it up, be successful in achieving change or outcomes for the betterment of humanity and the physical environment, but also maybe you may have learned over and I think you talked a little bit about that earlier on in terms of strategies that may have been an approach that you took when you were younger that may, with a bit of hindsight now, have been moderated, or maybe there's a time for certain things in certain places, but at the end of the day, some things may be lessons learned that you could offer to that younger generation coming through.
Well, first of all, the righteous anger is a powerful driver of action. And the thing is not to be so righteous that you cannot hear the other people around you and appreciate their own good characteristics. So dividing the world into sharp, good and evil is not a great way to advance anything. It's certainly a way to sort of get a snapshot, but the main way change comes about is by new majorities being developed, coming together, and that when people change their mind, change their view, how do you change views? You have to have a dialogue and a good communication. It can't be a one-way thing. So, that's why people might think this sort of language is a bit more tempered, but it's definitely the case that successful campaigns and successful social change for the good comes from persuading people to change their minds or to decide that something that they'd been ignoring, they should do something about. They might really still think the same as you, but they don't want to do anything. So there's that as well. So, I'm often on the street yelling slogans, and I don't think that there's any sort of case to say that you shouldn't be doing that. But that's just a general point. You do have to think about what your slogans really are and who you're shouting them at, and all of that. So I just think maybe younger people underestimate the importance of communication and maybe a bit less confident about their own way to articulate things, and more strident in their sense that things have got to change, and they're stamping their feet and demanding the change. So sometimes people switch off and won't. There's a limit to the impact of that. But having said that, Alopi, I think we can't talk too much about the long run. I think that the younger generation have grasped this point rather well, and the older generations are very complacent about the dangers that the whole world is facing. So I do think that we all need to sort of flick the switch to give ourselves a bit of a buzz and get into action. Don't wait for somebody else to try to address the problems which are around us. And one more way to, we need money, and people need to live while they do this work of making our society more human and more sustainable. And that really means, bigger, being able to trust each other to create more networks that or organisations where you can gather money together from our little bits of income, say relative to big business, and sustain the activists who are key to organising things. So I think there's quite a lot of people, young people, who get jobs in NGOs where they can live and have a future, but they're all constrained by contractual things with funding bodies, or limited to the rather specific goals of the organisation, and they're not quite able to challenge the bigger forces which have to be challenged. So there's as a frustration, we've got a lot of the makings though already around us: activity, energy, imagination, and resources. It's just not united enough at this stage.
There's so much in this conversation that we could talk, I think, for a long time about, but we've come to the end of our short interview. This is a question I ask every person that's on a JustER generation, and I think it's a bit of people actually find it a bit hard to answer, but which surprised me because it's one of those sort of standard questions. But if there were 3 pieces of advice you would give your younger self on lessons learnt, what would they be?
Well, one of them is, don't be bullied into doing something you don't want to do by peer pressure or threats or anything like that. Another is to believe in yourself. Look at yourself carefully, but what you find you should like, and you should be confident that this is precious. Your life's precious, and you're going to make a difference to the world. And the third is don't ever give in. Be sensible, but there's no future if people stop making the future better.
Wow, that's fantastic! Fantastic advice to your younger self. I hope your younger self is listening.
He was.
Thank you for your time. It's been great to have you on a JustER generation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Alopi.
Thank you for listening to this episode of A JustER Generation. It's through supporters like yourself that we keep our work going. You can support the work of the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education by making a donation through our website, www.erc.org.au. The Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is part of Edmund Rice Community Services. I'm Alopi Latukefu. Until next time, goodbye.